but was just not getting that benefit of understanding conversation in any number of different environments. So that's when we're looking at an implant.
And so how is the pathway if I was to choose a cochlear implant? Stephen, I don't know if you know this, but I actually have a hearing loss. I'm profoundly deaf in one ear. I had an accident when I was young and can no longer hear out of that ear. So if I was to have a look at that, what pathway would I go down as an adult compared to if I was a parent of a child who was diagnosed with a hearing loss?
Sure. So with adults, again, if they haven't already been seeing an audiologist, then I'd always recommend we do a hearing aid trial first. I mean, it's a bit different in terms of a profound loss, because I guess a hearing aid is not going to work. But even in that situation, if it's just in one ear, I'd say maybe try a cross trial, or there are other options prior to an implant. But then once they've seen an audiologist and they're happy, then I'd normally get them to be seen at an implant clinic, because it's a bit different in terms of the counselling and the rehabilitation process, which is obviously a bit longer with an implant than it would be with a hearing aid. So you need to be aware that it's not a magical fix straight away. There's a lot of work on your behalf if you do proceed with an implant in terms of rehabilitation, both auditory and speech for children, but mainly auditory for adults, but possibly speech in some. So that all needs to be made very clear. There's a lot of education process around that before even getting to that next step.
And what's the typical time that it takes to heal in terms of once you've had an implant?
Oh, well, thankfully it's very quick, because anything in the head and neck, it heals very quickly. So usually the process, if you have your operation, you would, the wound is pretty much healed within a week or so. It's obviously still a bit uncomfortable for a few weeks, but we're looking at about a week or so for the immediate surgery to be settled, and then the implant can be turned on about 2 or 3 weeks post-operatively. So I normally tell people plan for about a week off work, just because it's a bit uncomfortable, maybe a little bit dizzy for the first week, and then that should usually all settle down.
Brilliant. I'm going to ask one more question and let you go, because I can see that you're actually in a theatre room as we speak. So we do really appreciate your time this morning. You played a really important role at a certain football game by being a goal umpire a couple of years back.
Yeah.
I still have parents talk to me today about the fact that you as a surgeon and being involved in that game was one of the things that they really enjoyed. Will you do it again for us? Not to put you on the spot or anything.
No, but you see that maybe the only other thing I'm good at is supporting Freo, so I'm very happy to be in there. Yeah.
Well, we won't hold that against you, but we do appreciate your time, and I will let you go, and thank you for participating in the event this morning.
Thanks, everyone. See you.
Going to the rest of the panel, if I can, I'll actually turn to you, Mel, now, and probably take a little bit of a step back, if we can. You've not long been in Perth. How are you finding the heat over the summer?
Oh, well, I have been in Perth for about 8 months, and oh my goodness, that was the hottest summer I have ever experienced. I've never experienced anything like it. And it's all part of my great Australian adventure coming over here. I've been in Australia for 3 years. 3 years ago, 3 years tomorrow, actually. So yeah, it's lovely in Perth, but that heat, oh my goodness.
But let's talk about hearing loss. Your research in your area of speciality, you're taking us right back. Talk to us about the impact of hearing loss, particularly in adults, and the relationships that they have with the people that they love.
So what I caught probably about half an hour's worth of the stories before we came on today. And I think there were lots of stories there that really tapped into some of the issues. You could see that people were having difficulties with their family and their friends because they can't communicate so well. And one of there's a number of consequences of hearing loss, and one is social withdrawal. I think somebody mentioned that. So people withdraw, for example, if they're in the dinner table with their family, they can't hear what's going on, they can't communicate, they become socially withdrawn. And this can lead to problems in terms of people's psychosocial well-being, their mental well-being. And, you know, there's a number of studies that have come out relatively recently showing that untreated, unmanaged hearing loss is associated with mental health problems such as depression, anxiety, and also an increased risk of dementia. So, and that has received a lot of press over the last couple of years. So, you know, there were some really good messages that I saw today. If you've got any problems with your hearing, get it sorted out straight away. People wait on average 9 years before noticing they've got hearing difficulties, doing something about it. And we know that hearing aids these days are much, much more effective than they were, say, 30 years ago. There's lots of developments with new technologies around smartphone connected hearing aids. And we heard from Justin, there are sort of new types of hearing devices coming on the market called hearables. So, you know, do something about your hearing as soon as you notice it. It's really important. And, you know, people who get fitted with devices younger have better outcomes. And there's lots of evidence for that.
You mentioned there the link between hearing loss and cognitive decline or dementia, and I see that Margaret's asked that question too.
Yes.
Do we know whether the fitting of devices actually slows that cognitive decline, or is it the opposite is true? When you don't have access to hearing, that we know the link between hearing loss and dementia, but do we know that if you fit the devices and sooner, do you slow that decline down?
Yeah, that was a really great question, Margaret. We did some work a few years ago identifying top research priorities, and that was, I think it was number 2 in our top 10. So where we're at with this, there's been quite a lot of work on looking at hearing loss and dementia for the last decade, and more recently, over the last 5 years, there's an increasing awareness of the relationship between hearing loss, untreated hearing loss, and dementia. And what we know is that we don't know for certain that hearing aids slow down or stop cognitive decline or impairment, but there's a couple of studies taking place around the world, one in Perth. So one of my colleagues, Donna J. Cody, is doing a study looking to see whether hearing aids are able to slow down cognitive impairment in people with mild cognitive impairment. So we'll have those results probably towards the end of next year. It's a really well-run study. There are suggestions that there's some suggestions that have come out recently suggesting that this is the case, that it can help with memory. And we know that when people get fitted with hearing aids, if you conduct cognitive tests before they get the hearing aids and after they've had the hearing aids, when they've worn them for a while, their cognitive processes are better, because in part because there's a lot of effort involved in listening. And if a lot of effort is being spent on listening, a lot of cognitive resources are being spent on listening to be able to have conversations, that takes away the cognitive resources that are available for other things. So there is quite a bit of evidence to show that by wearing hearing aids, and hearing aids in particular, and also cochlear implants, that cognitive function improves, which is not quite the same as slowing down cognitive decline. And I think we will start getting the answers to those questions in the next year or so.
So the question that sort of stems from that is, for someone who has had lifelong hearing loss, and I'll use my example, you know, I've had a hearing loss since I was 9 and now in my late 40s. Is the same true, or is it different if you've actually had that degenerative hearing loss later in life? Is there any research that shows any relationship between the mental health impacts of hearing loss for those who have had lifelong hearing loss, whether they sign or acquire, or is it sensorineural? Talk to us about that sort of space.
Yeah, there's much less research on looking at people who've had sort of you know, lifelong hearing loss like you talk about. We did do a study looking at people who had single-sided hearing loss or deafness, so they've got good hearing in one ear and poor hearing in the other. And for years we thought, well, if you can hear well in one ear, you're fine. Just, you know, there's no problem. But actually, that's not the case. People who've got hearing loss in one ear have many more hearing difficulties than we originally thought. And in a study we did, we showed that people who had a sudden loss of hearing loss in one ear, if it happened fairly recently, that was a problem to them. But people who'd had it maybe congenitally or the like, they'd kind of got used to it. I would say, if, you know, for example, if there's people who've got long-standing hearing losses and haven't done anything about it, or a long-standing hearing loss in one ear, you know, go to see your audiologist and see what can be done, because almost certainly that will help. With single-sided deafness, just having a hearing aid on that side, or there's other technologies which just balances the sound and people can hear the environment better. So yeah, I mean, the key message which is going to come out today is go and see your audiologist if you've got hearing difficulties.
I think that's a consistent theme that we've heard today. Ray, I might bring you into this conversation now, because I do want to keep that mental health side of the conversation going and understand what it's like for children or teenagers at this time, particularly with COVID and mask wearing. What do you hear from the students that you support around the impact that this is having on their mental well-being?
Well, can you hear me? Sorry. Yep. What we see, or what I see, is quite a few students choose to not come to school when there's COVID hits, because they have to wear masks, or they're exposed to people wearing masks, because communication is key for all of us. And when students, particularly if I have signing students and they're relying on lip reading people who can't sign, and these people have masks on, then the students get very anxious and quite often can choose not to come to school. And I can relate to that. It is, if I'm in a situation where someone has a mask on and I'm trying to communicate with them, it's anxiety ridden. I had a doctor's appointment recently and I said, listen, can I keep my mask on, and if you could just take yours off, please? And the doctor refused, and it was a very difficult appointment. So I know for the students it can be very difficult and they get very anxious.
And one of the things that we hear a lot about as practitioners in this space is obviously the mental health impacts and the identity for children who are profoundly deaf or have hearing loss as they get through their teens. What supports should we be putting in place as a community to support particularly those teenagers as they're going through that really important transition of life, if they have a hearing loss? Is there anything specific that we should be doing, that we should be advocating for to support children as they go through that, particularly now with COVID?
Oh, I'm not sure I understand the question. So you mean as it community supports, how to support children with hearing loss in general?
Yeah, how do we actually create better understanding for these kids? Because we know that journey for them is not always the easiest.
Oh, absolutely. I think of an example of a student who went for a driving test. I think compassion, empathy are key. A student who went for a driving test, he asked the driving instructor to remove their mask. The driving instructor refused, even though it's legislated that they can ask for a driving instructor to remove their mask. And so that student couldn't lip read for the test, so couldn't follow instructions. The student failed that driving test, and there were repercussions from that, because this student was looking to apply for apprenticeships and couldn't secure one without a driver's license. So I think it's all about compassion, empathy. I would ask people to put themselves in the shoes of someone who has a profound hearing loss. What would it be like to be that person for a day? If you have a person with a hearing loss turning up at an emergency department, and someone is covering their mouth and that person is reliant on lip reading, how can I support this person to make the journey that they're currently on a little less anxiety-ridden. I heard a story of someone who was profoundly deaf and who was implanted and very distressed in the emergency department, and one of the doctors said, do you have a cochlear 7? So the doctor was educated enough to and aware enough to understand what that meant, and the doctor said, I will call you. So the doctor actually phoned that person knowing that the cochlear 7 Wi-Fi connected to the person's phone, and they had a conversation. So the doctor was able to keep her mask on, the patient could keep their mask on, and they had a conversation, so that communication was allowed or, available. I think compassion, education, support, empathy.
Thanks. Andre, I'm going to bring you into the conversation now, because we spoke a little bit with Mel around single-sided deafness, and obviously you've got a research interest in that. What are the benefits that you've seen for people to get an implant or a hearing aid in one ear, and why should people like me and others, I think it's a lot more prevalent than people think, but why should we then go down that path?
Yeah, so I think there's quite a few options. So firstly, most people that hear in only one ear, they have difficulty hearing in noise, or more difficulty hearing in noise, and also localizing where sound is coming from. And so some options that can help with that is, Dr. Rodriguez mentioned on it, but something like a CROS hearing aid, which sends the sound from the deaf ear over to the other side. And that can help in, say, a restaurant setting. It can help at least let you know or talk to people on that side. However, it doesn't give your brain information from both ears, and that's where something like a cochlear implant can work or can help. It does show, or research does show, that you will or can get improvements in localization. You can hear in noise a lot easier, which can then reduce listening effort and also improve quality of life.
Brilliant. In doing that, do hearing aids or cochlear implants, being a physio and having some expertise in that space, do aids or implants actually impact people's balance positively or negatively if they're going through that sort of process?
Yeah, that's a tricky question, because where is the balance issue? So is the balance issue initially from what caused the hearing loss in one ear, or is the balance issue caused, say, by a surgery of a cochlear implant? Or is it caused by the environment being quite chaotic or noisy, and you're not having the ability to localize or know where sound is coming from, which can then cause a lot of distress? I think what is important is that physiotherapy can really help. Your brain is an amazing thing. Balance relies on your vision, all your muscles and your ears all working together. So physiotherapy can help retrain the systems that aren't working as well. It's tricky to know whether a hearing device can help. And there, I think I've seen some research showing that in children a cochlear implant can help, but that's not necessarily my field. It's a tricky one. It's tricky where it's coming from and what's causing it.
Thanks. Ray, I'll get to you in a sec. I just have one more quick question for Andre before we do. Andre, one of the areas that you've said that you've got an interest in is also tinnitus. And a lot of people are affected by tinnitus, but we don't seem to talk about it anywhere near as much. What are the treatments that are available for people who have tinnitus, and how do we actually start to get that communication moving so people get those supports early?
Yeah, so I think awareness is the main one. I think a theme that's come up is that deafness is invisible, tinnitus is also invisible. So starting the conversation early is very important. Tinnitus is tricky because a lot of health professionals want to stay away from it. There's no easy cure, there's no easy fix. And I think education throughout the medical community would be, is very important. Also, tinnitus requires a multidisciplinary team. So it's not just an audiologist, it's the GP, it's a specialist like Dr. Rodriguez, it's the patient, the family. It's kind of everybody involved understanding and supporting. Treatments available usually start with sound enrichment and counselling. And depending on where the person is and how distressed they are, you can get very good results.
So I suffer from tinnitus, I think, ever since I've had that single-sided deafness. And I notice it gets worse when I drink. Why is that?
That's the tricky one. I'm guessing it also gets worse when you're stressed or when you haven't had enough sleep. So it shows that tinnitus is not just about hearing, it's about your emotional state.
Okay. Ray, you've got your hand up, I see.
Yes. Sorry, I'm just checking. Something that I needed to mention as well, in the community, we have maximising communication for deaf people. I know for myself, if I have a diploma of Auslan, so I can communicate via Auslan, and we need to remember there is a community of people that their first language is Auslan. So going to out in the community, that is the language of choice for them. So if you were to meet someone who was deaf, you can't assume that they're safe, like myself, they have devices and they can speak. They may be people who have their Auslan is their first choice, their first language. So need to be open-minded about the type of communication that people may choose as a deaf person or someone with hearing loss. So if, for example, that doctor asked me or has asked someone, can I use a phone to call you? No, that won't work for me. You need to be open. Can I write notes? Can I communicate with you that way? Yes. But if you encounter a deaf person who Auslan is their first language, then particularly there are some circumstances, like with doctor's appointments and in hospitals, where the first question should be, can we provide you with an interpreter? So, yeah, I think we need to provide that support for people in the community with profound hearing loss.
Thanks. I think that the communication part that you raised there, and the need to ensure communication happens at all whole range of different scenarios, is a really critical one. I think that we heard from Belinda in the pre-record, as well as a mum with children with ear health issues and constant gluia around that delay that happens in terms of their speech development and the experience that she had in that space. So I'm going to use that segue to bring in Chris. Chris, how many kids actually suffer from gluia, and when is it most prevalent?
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for having us along. It's a really good question, and something that we have looked at. So it's really common, is the short answer. There's been a prevalence study done in WA looking at the whole population, and it's actually about 1 in 4 kids by the age of 3 years have a history of recurrent ear disease or gluia. So that's sort of having 3 or more episodes of otitis media. The reason why that's important is because a lot of kids tend to have, 1 or 2 episodes, but actually having a recurrent disease is really what can be most concerning. So yeah, it's up to a quarter of the population having recurrent ear disease, but within that, there's a group who, there's a smaller group who it will be much worse for, and some who will kind of resolve on its own for. So it's very common. One of the most common reasons for getting antibiotics and, referred for surgery as well to treat it.
Before I ask you the next question, I'll just remind anyone, if they've got a question for any of our panellists, please, again, use the chat forum as much as you can. Margaret, I'll get to your question in a sec. talk to me about the state. We have a very broad state which has the beautiful southwest full of trees and the dirt up in the north. What's the journey like for kids in Perth when they have otitis media compared to, say, someone in Fitzroy Crossing or Meekatharra? I mean, how does it vary for them, and does it change the prevalence that we're seeing in those communities?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's a really interesting challenge within this state. You know, I don't really like the term postcode lottery, but it's a little bit like that across WA. There are some regional areas where there's very good ear service provision, and there might be a visiting ENT service or visiting audiology service and a great local screening program. And actually finding access to care is not that difficult. And for Aboriginal families, there might be, you know, local Aboriginal health officers who can provide that culturally appropriate care as well. Like Kalgoorlie is a good example down there. They have a good program as well. But I think there are also a lot of areas which don't have that, and it's very difficult. And even if you can get access to some screening, you get put on a waiting list for treatment, which will be down in Perth. And for a lot of families, getting to Perth is a very big undertaking if you're up in the top end, especially. It can be really difficult. So it really does depend where you're living and what those local services are. And I think, you know, there's been a big push to have a more coordinated approach to how the care is provided. But it's we're a huge state, so it's an ongoing piece of work. But yeah, it's a problem.
The data tells us that Aboriginal kids are off air 10 times more likely than non-Aboriginal kids in this state. What's your research been around supporting families with, you know, Aboriginal families with glue ear or ear health issues, and what's some of the sort of developments that we're seeing in that space at the moment?
Sure. Okay. So there's a couple of things there. One of the recent things we've found is we did a study in Perth and compared that with a study in Kalgoorlie for very young Aboriginal children in their first year of life. And it actually showed that there were almost equal rates of ear disease in the city versus the regional areas of Australia, Western Australia, which is really interesting because a lot of the research is focused on regional areas. So knowing that we have that high burden of the disease in Perth has been really powerful in trying to mobilise more services in the urban area. Because we also have access to care issues in Perth in that there's, you know, we have one tertiary children's hospital, there are long waiting lists for care. So if lots of kids are getting referred, particularly with COVID now, which impacts how many kids get seen at the hospital, it can really leave kids waiting quite a long time to get seen. So in terms of the rates of ear disease, so we talked about a quarter of the general population having quite a mild form of ear disease. And like I say, within that, a lot will resolve on its own. It's about 10% of the population who will end up having long-standing effusion and need surgery or something like that. For Aboriginal kids in our study, when we followed them up at 1 year of age, about 2/3 had a history of ear disease at more than 1 point in their first year of life, and about 50% had a measurable hearing loss. So that's very high compared to the general population. And that's for kids living, you know, in Perth.
So talk to me then about some of the research that you're doing and some of the research that's been done. I mean, I'd imagine that if you had a magic wand, not that you're a fairy, but, you know, had a magic wand that you could wave and get rid of otitis media or ear disease, or at least drop the prevalence significantly, what would you do? What's your research telling you that you should focus on? All of that sort of stuff.
Well, what the research is telling us is to get in early. So it's about that early identification, because a lot of the treatments that we have at the moment are really around primary care, around prevention and, you know, treatment at the primary care level. Surgery is something that comes later if there's persistent disease. But, you know, there's a lot of kids who, like a lot of this, it's silent. You know, not all kids have sore ears when they have an ear infection. They just have a slow build-up of fluid behind the ear. and they can't hear, and it goes unnoticed for a certain period of time. And by the time they do get care, it's already having an impact on their development. So it's about routine screening, getting in early, even when families are not sure if there's a problem. So providing that service. And this is for all families, but for Aboriginal families, making sure it's culturally appropriate. The program there's Aboriginal staff who are, connected to the local community and understand the needs of the family. In terms of the treatment, our treatments need to improve. We actually, the treatment for otitis media hasn't moved on very far in the last few decades. And what we're seeing now is that even kids who are going for surgery to have the, the effusion that builds up behind the ear, all the pus removed, there is a thin layer that often remains, which is called a biofilm, which contains all the bugs that were there in the first place. So then the infection just comes back after the operation. So there are trials going on at the moment for new drugs that can actually break down that biofilm and get antibiotics in to kill the bugs that are causing the infections. And, there's great hope that will help reduce the number of surgeries needed and repeat surgeries. There's also things like nasal sprays that they want to try in very young kids to actually kind of get in before that biofilm full of bacteria builds up. So to try and prevent that occurring in the first place. So it's great that there's a lot of new therapies coming through, and I think it'd be really interesting to see the results of some of those trials. But at the moment, there is a gap in that, although our care is not perfect, we're not even providing it at the right time at the moment. So it's about providing really prompt access to screening and care at the moment and developing new therapies as well.
For a child particularly who goes through that, do we know what they hear? I mean, we heard from Ray before in the pre-record about, her illness and that impact it had on her hearing and what she was actually hearing. What is it like for a child that is going through that chronic middle ear infection space? Do we know how do they tell us about how it's impacting their hearing and what they do and don't hear?
Yeah, descriptions can range from muffled to feeling underwater. The hearing loss can range from mild to quite severe as well. And so for some kids, they might not be particularly affected, but others find it extremely difficult. And I think the other thing is that it can fluctuate, which can also be a challenge as well in the way, you have a developing auditory processing system and you're not getting consistent input. So that can be a challenge.
Belinda, I see that you've got a question there.
Not a question so much. My daughter actually gave a really good analogy now that she doesn't have recurrent glue ear. And she said what it sounds like is when you go underwater in the pool and somebody's talking to you from the surface. She said that's what it sounds like. Yeah. So that's the best analogy I've heard so far anyway.
That's a good one. I like
that. Share that one.
Like it.
Going back and talking about the impact of hearing loss and coming back to you, Ray, a little bit in terms of being the only member on our panel that is profoundly deaf. I'd like to unpack your story a bit. And we talked a bit more before about your journey and that illness and what it caused for you. Tell us the impact it's had on you and your family. Hang on, Ray, I think you're muted. You might need to actually unmute yourself.
I thought I had. Oh, all of you, your lip reading skills are terrible. I think Mel touched on it. Deafness is very isolating. I can, and like Alex spoke in the pre-record, I was very good at doing all the talking. But I would continue with my children. They were involved in sport, Auskick, all that sort of thing. But I could talk, but I couldn't hear what the other parents were saying. So over time, I did things like I volunteered at the canteen, because then I'd just keep serving. I didn't actually have to have conversations with people. But as my hearing loss got progressively worse, I couldn't engage in those conversations. So the family got more and more isolated. The children got invited to fewer and fewer party events. And eventually I couldn't work. So I was unemployed. And I remember at one stage the kids saying, "Why aren't we invited to parties anymore?" Which was, so yeah, no, it's quite, and I got, very depressed. You lose your identity. I lost my job. So I lost my identity as an employed woman supporting her family. Yeah. I have, I think I had the implant November 2013, I think, and and then I started to learn Auslan in 2014. The combination of those two things, by 2015, I was working at Shenton College Deaf Education Centre. So I regained my identity, but the impact on the family was ongoing as a deaf person. So I could hear again, which was fantastic. I think when the first implant was switched on, I didn't realise that my hearing loss so progressive. I had not heard the letter S, and I didn't realise I hadn't heard the letter S. My poor son, I went home, there was a Stephen Parrish book about 6 snakes slithering through the grass, and I must have read that to him about 20 times, poor bugger. I'm sorry about that. Anyway, but my home, my family are very good. The captions are always on the films. They turn the radio off. If we're speaking at the dinner table, everyone talks one at a time. So, I'm very good at self-advocating, but our house is quiet. It's not a noisy home. So they've learnt to accommodate me very highly. I thought that was a great thing. Apparently not. My son, who's in year 12, has gone to live with his girlfriend's house because theirs is a noisy, rambunctious place where everyone can talk at once, and he gets to be involved in that. So there are ongoing impacts from my hearing loss on my family. So they've never had that. They've never had a dinner table where, everyone can talk over the top of each other and everyone can follow it, because ours has been quite a controlled situation. So I've had to learn everyone's had to adjust and accommodate over time. So now usually if we have dinners together, we will have a quiet time when mummy's at the table and everyone talks one at a time and I find out what's going on. And then after about 20 minutes, I leave, and then there's a free-for-all. So, but, having my son leave my home before he'd finished school to live with his girlfriend, and he actually applied to Centrelink to get youth allowance because mummy's deaf and I don't like living there. It was quite heartbreaking at the time. So yeah, my hearing loss has had profound impact on my family.
And what about you? How are you now?
I think you learn, acceptance is key to surviving hearing loss. Accepting you have a hearing loss, it's not coming back. Making sure you do whatever you can to access communication. So I've got the best devices I can have. I go and get the best support I can get. I learn Auslan. That gives me access to more communication. I've got my NDIS. I can book interpreters to support me at social functions. I make sure that I can go out so I'm not isolated. And I keep busy, I self-advocate, and I embrace any app that comes along. God bless mini mics, right? Which I take everywhere. If they go flat, it's like, I want to go home now. So I would encourage anyone with a hearing loss to take on every support you can to support yourself, support your family, so you can communicate at work, at home, and accept what has happened. And listen, I have to accept what's happening with my son and keep those doors open, and he's coming home now more and more. It is what
Ray, there is no doubt that you are a very strong woman, and I cannot thank you enough for sharing your story today.
You're welcome.
I've known you for a few years now and never knew that story until a couple of months back. I'm just really grateful that you are here and sharing that with us so we can actually understand what it's like to be in your shoes. But I am going to do one thing before we finish, and that's with all of our panellists. There's 3 things that I'm going to ask you, one of which is tell us your funniest story, because I know you've all got one. I think we need to leave this on a positive note. Second is, what's your key message for anyone that you support and help? And the third one is, if you had a magic wand, I keep going back to magic wands, there's not a sort of fetish of mine or anything, but if we have a magic wand and you could wave it to get rid of something, what would you use it for? And I'll start with you, Mel.
Right, you've caught us on the hop there, Mark. So funniest story. Well, this I actually told this story the other day, so it's at the top of my mind. It's not really to do with hearing loss as much as when I was a student. But I was years ago, so this is well over 30 years ago, and I was training to be an audiologist. The way that the philosophy was, get in there and do the testing. So it was probably my second week on the audiology course, and we had to test balance. So we heard a little bit about balance from Andre, and I can't go into the details of it, but it involves somebody lying down. You put water in the ear. It's called a caloric test. You put water in the ear. It makes them go dizzy. You turn the lights off, and you measure how dizzy they are, looking at their eye movements. It's all a bit complicated. Didn't know anything about it. And it was like, go in there, do a caloric test, Mel. So I put the water in there. You do with a tube, and it goes into the ear canal. And then I was like, well, right, 30 seconds. What do I do now? I was like, what do I do with the tube? So I put it in the tank, and you're supposed to put it in the clip. So I put it in the tank. Anyway, the lights went off. This poor woman's feeling dizzy. The first balance patient I'd ever seen. And the tube that I put back in the tank, the pressure was building up and building up and building up. And eventually the tube flicked out of the tank and it landed on a woman who was in the dark, who was feeling really, really dizzy. I'm laughing, it's not funny actually, but I was traumatized. And it landed on the woman who was feeling really dizzy. She was going, oh my God, I'm getting wet. And I was like, what's going on? And we're all in the dark. The technician was shouting, Mel, get the infrared viewer. And I'm like, what's an infrared viewer? And, you know, the patient was crying, I was crying. It was just the worst thing that could possibly ever happen to a student. And from then on, I have to go and say, my life as a student and as an audiologist got better and better. So that was my story of the horror of how British universities threw you in at the deep end. So that was my story. My key messages, we've heard loads about getting you tested, get your hearing tested sooner. What I would say to people is, and we heard a little bit from Ray about technology, there's a lot of technology out there. There's a lot of hearing aids that can be controlled by smartphones. Can be controlled by smartphones. So we've done studies. What else coming for me? We've done studies to show that people who have smartphone connected hearing aids can control their hearing aids. They can control their environment. They report having less stigma, They feel more empowered, there's less fatigue, they can hear better. And all the issues around, oh, I can't hear so well, people can control what they hear. So my key message is, and for older people as well, let's not just think just because somebody's older, they don't know how to use a smartphone. That's not true. Try and get smartphone connected hearing aids because they are so much better for you because you can control them. And finally, if I had to wave a magic wand, well, clearly, if we could eradicate hearing loss, the lives of billions of people around the world would be improved. And I know there's some work going on at the Ear Science Institute, Australia, to try and develop cures for the future. And in the meantime, we need to do the very, very best we can to get as many people with hearing loss given the support and the help from audiologists and their families, as we heard from Ray's very, very moving story, to get that support to make their lives better. So that's me. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Mel. Andre, same questions. Funniest story, magic wand, message to people.
Okay, well, about last week I had my son in the clinic with me. He does suffer from recurrent ear infections, and so I was testing his ears and I was having a look. We did all the tests and then he said, okay, it's my turn. And I said to him, oh, are you the audiologist now? And he goes back to me, no, Dad, I'm normal. Just a bit of a highlight that all audiologists are a little bit kooky. My key message is really embrace it. Hearing loss doesn't define you. You can still do anything and there are people there to support you. And if I had a magic wand, really I would be wanting to increase the awareness and reduce the stigma.
Thanks, Andre. Chris, same 3 questions.
Sure. Well, similar to Mel's, I suppose, I had a training incident where I was going for a new placement in the UK, and my headphones stopped working, so I just bought some cheap ones at the train station. I was like, oh, they look a bit small, but they'll be all right. Stuck them in, put them in for the long train ride. Rock up at the hospital, walk into the hospital, feeling pretty good, like going to be a fun placement, whip out my headphones, but only one had the earbud left on it, and try and find it, push it right down in. So my rock up to my new department and then have to ask one of the very kind but rather intimidating consultants to then pick something out of my ear. So that was, I don't know what the message is there apart from that, people are very kind when you make a fool of yourself, and maybe don't stick little things in your ears. So probably a good message. In terms of an actual key message to do with this, I would say get your hearing checked regularly for kids, and early. Like if you have concerns about your kids' hearing, like Andre's got the luxury of being able to do it himself and DIY surveillance, and that's great. But if you don't have access to that, because I do the same thing with my kids at home, they're very well practiced. But if you don't, then it's great to get a bit of surveillance early on. If you're worried, definitely get the ears checked. If I had a magic wand, I would make it so that all kids could just access the right care when they needed it.
I have to say, you guys aren't painting a really great picture about audiologists early in your practice. That's what I'm going to take away from your funny stories. But I am going to ask Ray the same 3 questions in terms of, funniest story, key message, magic wand.
Okay, my funny story. Well, I now can actually use my phone with the latest technology, which is brilliant. But before that, I used to put my phone on speakerphone and go through the air. And I used to have someone in my family there, and I'd be lip reading. They'd translate for me. I'd lip read. They'd tell me what whoever it was saying. If someone had a heavy accent, it was a nightmare. So one day I get a phone call. I answer it. I say, yes, hello. And then I'm looking at my partner, and he was basically, the person would speak and he'd nod and I go, yes, no, And then he held up this and I went, 10. Okay. And then he said, like, you finished. So I hung up and I said, what did I just agree to? And he said, oh, that was the insurance company over your lost phone. And I said, and? He said, you just told them you wanted an iPhone 10. And I went, oh, is that a good? He went, that's top of the range. I went, oh, happy days. So out of it, because I wouldn't, yeah, that was a good story. That was a good story. So my key message is, with hearing loss, you need access to the best communication. So communication is key, communication with your family, communication at work. So you do whatever you can to make sure you can communicate with the people in your lives. So if that means, for me, that meant learning Auslan. That's been amazing. I've got the latest technology devices. I started with hearing aids when they stopped giving me the best access to sound. I upgraded to cochlears and I get those upgraded. I get the latest technology. Me being able to use a phone again myself, I've taken control of my life. So that's my key message, communication. Give yourself the best access to communication you can. Magic wand. My magic wand would be that I would like to see Auslan being taught as the language of choice as an ESL in all primary schools. That's my magic wand.
Thanks, Ray, and thank you to everyone. And before I close off in terms of the panel and hand over to Barry McKinnon for closing remarks, there is a question there from Margaret about how available are masks with transparent panels. I know we trialled some early on within our practice, given that we have a number of speech therapists who support young kids, and they fogged up pretty quick. We're hearing that there's some stuff that's coming through the UK, but do any of our panellists have an insight into what might be best available for people if they wanted that clear panel in terms of that mask at the moment?
I've just asked the question, actually, Mark. I've just dropped a note into the chat for Margaret, so she had that answered. I mean, you can probably get them online, but I know that the Lions Hearing Clinic, which is part of the Ear Science Institute, have them available because of the problems that people are having. So definitely give the Lions Hearing Clinic a call and see if you can get them there. But they're probably available online, I would imagine. The reports are they do make a difference.
Thanks, Mel. Appreciate that. And I'll hand over to Barry McKinnon for some closing remarks.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks again to everybody for participating. Just to start with, can I just share with you our funny story? I'm involved in the Deafness Council because we have a son who's now in his 40s, but he was diagnosed at the age of 11 months and went to telephone speech and hearing, and he was attending in primary school their program at Newman College. And my wife used to pick him up every day from school, and he comes out, he saw them, Pam saw them through the window of the classroom at the end of the day with the teacher standing up saying something and the students responding. And Pam said to Michael, well, what happens at the end of the day? What do you say to the teacher? Oh, she says, good afternoon, boys and girls. And we say, you're bad news, Miss Jones. And Pam said, beg your pardon? He said, oh, yeah, we say you're bad news. I said, cool, couldn't work that out. So the next day, Pam goes to the school and walked in close to the school to hear what had happened. And of course, the teacher gets up and say, good afternoon, children. And the kids said, and may God bless you. So he was saying, may God bless you. And he thought they were saying you bad news, but never mind. Thank you very much for your participation. And can I, at the outset, say thank you to Lottery West. Lottery West have assisted us to put today together, and their funding is important. They've supported us for many years, and we appreciate that. And to all of the participants, Belinda, Ray, Ken, Steve, Alex, Justin, and Bob on the panel to start on the at the beginning, and then the panel in Mel, Ray, Chris, Andre, and Stephen. We appreciate very much your support. And of course, this will all be going on our website and be available to a whole lot more people, we hope. The messages that I got out of today were, there's several of them, of course, and I found it really stimulating. The first one would be, I guess, what Alex and Ray said in many respects, and that is, because you have a hearing loss at whatever level, it's not the end of your journey. It's the start of the journey in many ways, and accept it and get on with life. Don't delay at whatever age at getting the treatment or getting access to treatment. I guess the other third one was that Steve Coughlin said, and that is, which is not often the case, or is not as often as it should be, and that is, take your work environment seriously, no matter where you are. And it just stresses me when you go down the road and see a lawnmower operator not wearing earplugs or earphones or ear protection or just little things like that. It's a simple thing to do, and people should take it seriously. The fourth one that I've got here of the 5 would be, and it's self-evident to people like us, I suppose, but we need to educate people more about it. And that is, the level of deafness, of course, varies for every individual, as does their answer. They can choose whatever option they would like to address that issue, and we should respect that option, whether it's Auslan or a hearing aid or a cochlear, or like John Byrne chooses to communicate in the written form. It doesn't matter much what it is. Communication is the key, as Ray has said, but respect the choice that people make. And I guess finally, which would be my wish, if there was a wish in answer to your question, Mark, would be to educate people and to make sure people understood the issues about hearing loss. As Ray said, as my son has said, this wearing of masks through COVID has been distressing for people who lip read and rely on lip reading all the time. And what distresses me most is that people won't take their mask off. That's happened to my son a couple of times, as it's happened to Ray, and as I'm sure it's happened to others. If people understood and we could educate people more, then they'd be more responsive, in my opinion, to that process. And finally, then, on behalf of the people on the council, can I just say to Mark, thank you very much, Mark. Mark put a power of work into putting today together, he and the committee that have worked with him. And of course, he handled the process of monitoring the panel, I think, very, very well. And if Jeff Parry does get back from overseas, then he might be looking for another job, because Mark, of course, did an outstanding job himself and would be an asset to Channel 7 at any time. So thank you all again for your participation. We appreciate it very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you again.
And thank you everyone for connecting with us today. We really appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.